The rain did not merely fall, it executed a slow, rhythmic siege upon Belrosi Manor. For 3 days, the sky had been the color of a bruised lung, exhaling a relentless mist that turned the manicured gardens into a sodden graveyard of drowned lily. Inside, the air tasted of damp wool and the metallic ang of impending ruin, a scent Margaret had come to associate with her father's breath. Margaret stood in the throat of the hallway, her shadow stretching long and skeletal across the warped floorboards. She was watching the study door. Behind that heavy oak barrier, the scratch of a quill sounded like a bone scraping against stone. Scratch. Dip scratch. It was the sound of a man accounting for his failures. Her father, Silas Belrosi, had not looked at her for a week. To him, she was no longer a daughter, she was a ledger entry that refused to balance. He wore the same velvet waistcoat, now frayed at the edges, a symbol of a man clinging to the wreckage of a sinking ship. Her mother's jewel-white box sat on the vanity upstairs, hollowed out like a looted tomb. One by one, the sapphires and pearls had vanished, sacrificed to the gods of the gaming table and the silent, hungry men in black coats who frequented their doorstep. Margaret pushed the door open. The movement was silent, practiced. Silas was hunched over the family ledger, a massive volume bound in calfskin that held the weight of for centuries of Belrosi blood. The room was illuminated by a single, guttering candle, casting long, dancing demons across the walls. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. "You have a habit of lingering in doorways, Margaret," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "It is a trait common in servants and ghosts, neither of which are welcome in this study." "I am neither, father," Margaret replied, her voice flatter than she felt. The bitterness was a cold stone in her stomach, heavy and immovable. "Though I suspect a ghost would have a warmer reception in this house than a daughter who costs more than she earns." Silas finally lifted his head. His eyes were watery, pale blue orbs that seemed to have lost the ability to perceive anything but debt. He dipped his quill into the inkwell with a trembling hand, tapped it twice against the ream, a fastidious habit that felt like a mockery of order, and returned to the page. With a single horizontal stroke, he drew a line through her name. Margaret Abigail Belrosi. The black ink bled into the yellowed parchment, obscuring her identity as if she were a cancelled debt. It was neat. It was final. "The line is remarkably straight," Margaret observed, stepping closer. "Have you been practicing? Or does the skill of erasing ones can come naturally with age?" Silas slammed the ledger shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cramped room. "Enough? Do you think I enjoy this? Every decision I have made for the preservation of this name. The Belrosi legacy does not end with me because I lack the stomach for hard choices." "The legacy," Margaret whispered, her gaze moving to the window. Out in the drive, the gray veil of rain parted for a moment, revealing a silhouette that made her heart stutter. A carriage, black as a widow's weeds, pulled by for horses the color of smoke. It sat motionless, an omen on wheels. There was no crest on the door, no liveried footmen. It was a utilitarian vessel designed for a transaction. "He is here," she said. Silas stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He drew himself up, trying to find the stature he had lost years ago. The Duke of Crestmont is a man of significant influence. His unconventional needs provided us with an opportunity that no other house would offer. You should be grateful, Margaret. Girls with your condition are usually relegated to the shadows of a nunnery or the back rooms of a relative's estate. Grateful, she repeated, the word tasting like copper. I believe the legal term for this opportunity is a bill of sale, father. How much did the Duke pay for a wound that will never quicken? Was I worth the coal rights in the north, or just enough to cover your losses at the club? The slap came sudden and sharp. Margaret's head snapped to the side. She tasted blood where her teeth had nicked the inside of her cheek. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply turned her face back to him, her eyes burning with a light that made the old man flinch. Compose yourself, Silas hissed, his hands still shaking. You will be demure. You will be obedient. You will show the Duke that despite your defect, you have been raised with the manners of a Belrosi. Your mother has packed what is appropriate for your new circumstances. Appropriate, Margaret said, glancing at the small, battered trunk by the door. It contained the remnants of a life, 3 dresses, a handful of books, and the yellowed pearls her grandmother had given her. It was a pittance, a ghost's inheritance. She turned without another word and walked toward the hall. Her mother, Elizabeth, was standing by the stairs, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes. It was a practiced grief, a theatrical display designed to absolve her of the guilt of standing by while her firstborn was bartered away. "Oh, Margaret," Elizabeth wailed softly, "if only you hadn't had that fever. If only I were a person to you instead of a problem," Margaret finished for her. She walked past her mother, past the portraits of ancestors who seemed to avert their eyes, and stepped out into the rain. The cold air hit her like a physical blow, soaking through her thin cloak in seconds. The carriage door opened. A man stepped out. Not the Duke. She knew instinctively this was a subordinate. He was dressed in severe black, his face a mask of professional indifference. He didn't offer a hand. He simply waited. Margaret looked back at the house. Belrosi Manor, with its crumbling eaves and its atmosphere of polite desperation. It was a cage that had run out of birdseed. She stepped into the carriage. The interior smelled of expensive leather, tobacco, and a strange, lingering scent of ozone. As the door clicked shut, the world of her child had vanished. There was no one inside but the shadows. The carriage jolted forward. Margaret leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the manor disappear into the mist. She touched her finger where her father's ring had been removed that morning. She was Margaret Abigail Belrosi no longer. She was a purchase, an asset, a ghost being transported to a new haunting ground. And as the horses picked up speed, she felt a strange, terrifying sensation deep in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was the first sparks of a fire that would eventually burn Belrosi Manor to the ground. The journey to Crestmont Abbey was a descent into a world where the sun had long since surrendered. As the carriage climbed higher into the rugged terrain of the north, the manicured rolling hills of Kent were replaced by jagged limestone cliffs and forest, so thick they seemed to swallow the very light of day. Margaret sat in the center of the plush seat, refusing to let her body sway with the violent jolts of the iron-rimmed wheels. She stared at the darkness outside. Every mile was a stitch ripped from the fabric of her old life. She thought of Beatrice, likely already sleeping in the bed that had been Margaret's since she was 5. She thought of the empty space on the vanity where her grandmother's pearls used to sit. She was a hollowed-out thing, a vessel purged of its history. When the carriage finally slowed, it wasn't because of a welcoming gate, but because the road itself seemed to narrow into a throat of stone. Crestmont Abbey loomed out of the twilight like a prehistoric beast crouched upon the ridge. It was vast, a sprawling Gothic monument of gray granite that looked as though it had been carved from the mountain rather than built upon it. Hundreds of windows stared down like the sightless eyes of a gargoyle, cold and indifferent to her arrival. The door opened and the damp moor air rushed in, smelling of peat and ancient dust. "Your Grace." The man in black, the Duke's steward, stood by the steps. He did not offer a hand, nor did he offer a welcome. He simply gestured toward the massive arched entrance. Margaret gathered the hem of her damp silk dress, the fabric heavy and sodden, and stepped onto the cold stone. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but it gave off no warmth, only a flickering, orange light that made the suits of armor lining the walls look like a ghostly battalion standing guard. "The Duke is in the library," the steward said, his footsteps echoing like a rhythmic ticking clock. "He does not like to be kept waiting." "Then we have that in common," Margaret replied, her voice sounding unnervingly clear in the cavernous space. "I have spent my entire life waiting for things that never arrived. I find I have lost the patience for it." The steward paused, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, or perhaps pity crossing his weathered face before he resumed his pace. The library doors were 2 slabs of ancient oak bound in iron. When they swung open, the scent hit her leather, expensive brandy, and the sharp, ozone-like sting of a storm. It was a room of immense weight, thousands of books rising to a ceiling lost in the gloom. At the far end, silhouetted against a wall of flame, stood a man. He was taller than her father, his frame cut with a rugged precision that suggested a man of action rather than a man of ledgers. His hair was black as the ink that had erased her name, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and hard, unforgiving lines. He didn't turn immediately. He stood with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching the fire consume a log. "I am told you are Barren," he said. No greeting. No pleasantries. Just the clinical assessment of a buyer examining the flaws in a piece of livestock. Margaret felt the ghost of her father's slap burn on her cheek. She straightened her spine, her hands clasping her waist so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And I am told you are a duke. It seems we have both been defined by things we cannot change." Edmund Calder, the Duke of Cressmont, turned. His eyes were the color of a winter sea gray, turbulent, and holding no more warmth than a January pond. He studied her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a general looks at a map. He took in the dampness of her hair, the defiance in her chin, and the stained ribbon on her grandmother's dress. "You speak more than your father promised," Edmund observed, his voice a deep, resonant cello that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "He described you as compliant, a quiet liability he was eager to liquidate." "My father is a man who confuses silence with absence," Margaret said, stepping into the circle of firelight. "He thought because I could not produce an air, I had no voice. He was mistaken." Edmund moved toward her. He moved with a predatory grace, a silent fluidity that made Margaret's pulse thrum with a sudden, sharp instinct of danger. He stopped just inches from her, so close she could smell the smoke on his coat and the faint, bitter scent of almond on his breath. "Good," he whispered. "I have no use for a quiet wife. Silence in this house is a precursor to a knife in the dark." He reached out, his gloved fingers catching her chin, tilting her face toward the light. He inspected the bruise on her cheek, the purple bloom left by Silas's hand. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but his expression remained as cold as marble. "Did he do this because you refused to come?" Edmund asked. "He did it because I asked him how much I was worth," Margaret replied. Edmund let go of her chin, a ghost of a dark, humorless smile touching his lips. "You were worth a great deal to me, Margaret Abigail Belrosi. Far more than your father could comprehend. He thought he was cheating me, selling me a defective vessel for the price of a kingdom." "And weren't you?" she challenged. "A duke without an heir is a king without a future. Why buy a woman who ensures your line ends with your own breath?" Edmund turned back to the sideboard, pouring a second glass of brandy. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was electric, a jolt of heat that made her breath hitch. "Sit," he commanded. Margaret didn't sit. She remained standing, a small, defiant figure in a room built for giants. "My family," Edmund began, his gaze fixed on the fire, "is not a lineage. It is a slaughterhouse. My grandfather divided his assets among his sons, thinking he was being fair. Instead, he ignited a civil war that has lasted 3 generations. My father was poisoned by his own brother. 2 of my cousins were accidental victims of a hunting trip that involved no animals. My uncles are currently liquidated into various graves across Europe, all because of the Crestmont inheritance." He turned to her, his eyes burning with a cold, fierce intelligence. "An heir, Margaret, is not a blessing in this house. An heir is a target. A pawn to be kidnapped, a child to be manipulated, a reason for my remaining relatives to slit my throat while I sleep so they can act as regents for a minor they control." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. The air in the library suddenly felt thin. "You didn't buy a wife," she whispered. "You bought a dead end." "I bought a shield," Edmund corrected. "I married a woman who makes me useless to their schemes. A woman who removes the incentive for my assassination because there is no future beyond me to steal. By marrying you, I have effectively locked the door to the treasury and thrown away the key. He stepped closer again, the firelight casting his shadow over her like a shroud. Your father called you broken. He called you a liability. But to me, Margaret, your supposed defect is the only thing that allows me to breathe without checking the shadows. You are the most valuable asset I have ever acquired. Margaret looked down at the brandy in her glass. She saw her own reflection in the amber liquid, distorted, shimmering, and suddenly, strangely powerful. For 8 years, the word worthless had been her shadow. It had been the reason she was hidden in the back rooms, the reason she was denied the jewelry and the dresses and the love given to her sister. It had been her prison. And here in this dark, cold abbey at the edge of the world, that very same word had become her weapon. So this is a business arrangement, she said, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't known she possessed. I provide the infertility that secures your life, and in exchange, what do I receive? Aside from a husband who views me as a strategic maneuver. Edmund leaned in, his face inches from hers. You receive freedom, Margaret. Freedom from the Belrosi debts. Freedom from a father who strikes you for asking the truth. You will have your own funds, your own authority, and a house that is as much a fortress as it is a home. You will be a duchess in more than name. You will be the only person in this world I am required to trust. He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. But in exchange, you must never allow yourself to be used against me. You must be as cold and as iron-willed as the stone of this abbey. Can you do that, Margaret? Can you stop being a daughter and start being a partner in a war? Margaret thought of her name with the black line through it. She thought of the rain hammering against the windows of her father's study. She thought of the horses the color of smoke. Yes, she said, her voice a vow. I can do that. Edmund nodded, a single, decisive movement. He raised his glass to hers. Then welcome to Crestmont Abbey, your grace. Try not to get murdered. Margaret clinked her glass against his. The sound was sharp, final, and sounded remarkably like the closing of a cage, but for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the key. The morning at Crestmont Abbey was a silent executioner. There were no chirping birds, only the low, morning call of crows circling the granite battlements. Margaret woke in a bed large enough for 4, shrouded in heavy velvet curtains that smelled of lavender and centuries of stone dust. A silver tray sat on the nightstand, tea, toast, and a note written in a slashing, aggressive hand that seemed to cut the paper. I have departed for the northern mines. A dispute among the foremen that smells of my cousin Richard's influence. Explore the house. Trust no one but Mrs. H.R.X. Margaret sat up, the silk sheets cool against her skin. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a castle and left to guard a fortress whose walls were already crumbling from within. She spent the morning navigating the abbey. It was a labyrinth designed to confuse assassins' hallways that ended in abrupt stone drops, staircases that spiraled into windowless turrets, and heavy oak doors that lead to rooms draped in holland covers, looking like huddles of white ghosts. By noon, she found it the estate office. It was tucked away in the east wing behind a door that groaned as if complaining about the intrusion. Inside, the chaos was a physical weight. Ledgers were stacked in precarious hours, correspondence lay scattered like dead leaves, the inkwell on the desk was dry and cracked. Margaret approached the desk. Her fingers hovered over a massive volume bound in black leather. Silas had always forbidden her from touching the accounts. A woman's mind is a garden, Margaret, he had once told her, not a counting house. You will only muddy the blooms. Fortunately, Margaret whispered to the empty room, my garden I'd years ago. She pulled the chair back and began to work. For hours, the only sound was the rustle of parchment and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Margaret's mind, honed by years of secretly auditing her father's catastrophic failures, moved with the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't looking for balance, she was looking for the rot. And she found it. A duplicate entry for coal transport in May. A consultation fee paid to a firm in London that didn't exist in any trade registry. A systematic inflation of household costs by exactly 12%. The Duke was being robbed. Not with a knife, but with a quill. You have the look of a woman who has found a spider in her tea. Margaret didn't flinch. She slowly looked up to see a man leaning against the doorframe. He was younger than Edmund, dressed in a flamboyant waistcoat of gold brocade that looked garish against the abbey's somber stones. His eyes were small, dark, and restless. Richard Calder, the cousin who had spent his life waiting for Edmund to die. And you have the look of a man who enters rooms without knocking, Margaret replied, her voice cold. A habit common in those who fear what they might find behind a closed door. Richard laughed, a sharp, barking sound that lacked any real mirth. He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the ledgers. My cousin's little investment, the Barren Duchess. Tell me, has Edmund already grown bored with you? Leaving you to rot among the dust on your first day? The Duke is attending to matters that require a man of his stature, Margaret said, closing the ledger with a deliberate thud. I, however, find the dust here quite revealing. Richard leaned over the desk, his scent cloying cologne and stale brandy filling the air. Don't play the accountant, Margaret. It's unbecoming. You are here for one reason, to ensure the line ends. You are a biological deadbolt. Don't mistake that for importance. Margaret leaned forward, her face inches from his. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Men like Richard were used to women who shrank. They had no armor against women who sharpened. Let us speak plainly, Richard, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I have spent 4 hours in this room. In that time, I have found enough evidence of embezzlement to hang a dozen stewards. And interestingly, several of those payments led directly to a silent partner in the North, one who shares your initials. Richard went pale, the gold brocade of his vest suddenly seeming to strangle him. You're delusional. Those accounts are handled by the Duke's own men. Then the Duke's own men are remarkably generous to you, Margaret countered. If I were you, I would be very careful about how I speak to the woman who holds the Duke's trust and his ledgers. Edmund might have married me as a shield, but I find I am quite adept at becoming a sword. Richard straightened, his bravado replaced by a cold, calculating malice. You think you're safe here? You think Edmund will protect you once the novelty of your defect wears off? In this house, wives are as disposable as candles. Then I shall ensure I burn brightly enough to light the way to your ruin, Margaret said. Now get out. This room is for those who contribute to the estate, not those who bleed it. Richard turned on his heel and stormed out, his footsteps a jagged rhythm of fury. Margaret sat back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was trembling, but it wasn't fear, it was exhilaration. For the first time in her life she had fought, and she had won. The door creaked again. Mrs. Hrix, the housekeeper, stood there with a silver tray. Her eyes moved from the scattered papers to Margaret's flushed face. He is a venomous man, your grace, Mrs. Hrix said quietly. But venom only works if it enters the blood. He won't get close enough to bite, Margaret promised, taking the tea. Mrs. Hrix, I need the ledgers from the last 5 years. All of them. And I need to know which of the servants report to Richard. The older woman hesitated. Then a slow, knowing smile spread across her weathered face. The Duke told me you were an asset. I believe he underestimated you. 3 days later, the black carriage returned. Edmund walked into the library to find Margaret exactly where he had left her, but the room was transformed. The stacks of paper were gone, replaced by neat, labeled files. A fresh fire burned in the hearth, and a single ledger lay open in the center of the desk, marked with dozens of small, red slips. Edmund stood in the doorway, his coat stained with the mud of the north, his face weary. He looked at the room, then at Margaret. I leave for 3 days, he said, his voice a low rumble, and you have conquered my study. I haven't conquered it, Margaret said, standing. I have audited it. You are being drained, Edmund. Richard hasn't just been influencing the miners, he has been gutting your treasury through the household accounts. Edmund walked to the desk, his eyes scanning her notations. He went silent as he read the names, the dates, the amounts. The weariness in his face was replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. "He thought I wouldn't notice," Edmund whispered. "He thought I was too busy watching for poison to see the theft. He thought I was useless," Margaret said. "He came here to remind me of my condition. He wanted to make sure I knew I was nothing but a dead end." Edmund looked up. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he let it drop. The restraint was more intimate than a touch. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that I was a sword," Margaret said. Edmund stepped closer, the scent of the moor and the cold night clinging to him. For the first time, the winter sea gray of his eyes softened into something like embers. "My shield, my sword." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy pouch, dropping it on the desk. It clinked with the sound of gold. This was the bonus for the foreman. It turns out I didn't need it. They were surprisingly cooperative once I told them my wife was currently dismantling their employer's network at the Abbey. Margaret smiled. "It was a sharp, dangerous thing. We aren't a family, Edmund. We are a war machine." "Yes," Edmund agreed, his voice dropping an octave. "And it seems we have just won the first skirmish. But Richard will not take this lightly. He will go to your father. He will look for the one thing we haven't secured." "And what is that?" "Your reputation," Edmund said. "If he can't kill me, he will try to destroy the legitimacy of our marriage. He will claim I am holding you hostage. He will try to force an annulment." Margaret picked up her quill, her gaze fixed on the ledger. "Then let him try. He has no idea how much I have to gain by staying, and even less of an idea how much I am willing to do to ensure he never wins." Edmund watched her for a long moment, a look of profound, dark fascination on his face. He didn't speak of love. He didn't speak of passion. But as he stood beside her in the firelight, the silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a pact. The scandal arrived at Crestmont Abbey not in a carriage, but in a flurry of newsprint. The Morning Chronicle had a front page spread that set the moor air on fire. "The prisoner of Crestmont is the Duke hiding a broken bride to secure an empire." The article, penned with the oily precision of someone paid in Richard's gold, painted Silas Belrossi as a distraught father who had realized his tragic mistake. It alleged that Margaret was being held in isolation, her spirit crushed, denied the care of specialists who could restore her fertility. It was a masterpiece of Victorian melodrama, designed to turn the Duke into a monster and Margaret into a voiceless victim. "They want to drag us into the light," Edmund said, his eyes scanning the paper in the dim light of the breakfast room. "A public inquiry. Your father has filed a petition with the Court of Chancery. He wants the marriage annulled on the grounds of coercion and medical neglect." Margaret set down her tea, her hands perfectly steady. The fear that had once lived in her marrow had been replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. "He doesn't want me back, Edmund. He wants the Colwrights back. And Richard wants the Yorkshire estates that would pass to him if our marriage is dissolved without issue." Edmund looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The Ten will devour you. They will look at you and see only a defective duchess. Can you face them? Can you walk into a ballroom knowing they are calculating the emptiness of your womb?" Margaret stood, her burgundy traveling dress rustling against the stone floor. "I spent 20 years being looked at as a ghost, Edmund. Let them look. I would rather be a duchess they pity than a daughter they sold." London was a symphony of soot, carriage wheels, and the suffocating smell of ambition. They stayed at Calder House, a mansion in Mayfair that felt even colder than the Abbey. The invitations arrived like an avalanche, most of them thinly veiled attempts to witness the tragedy firsthand. The battlefield was chosen Lady Danbury's Nincian ball. When the doors to the ballroom opened, a hush fell over the room that was more violent than a scream. Margaret stepped onto the polished floor, her arm linked with Edmund's. She wore a gown of midnightable silk, encrusted with sapphires that matched the cold fire in her eyes. Around her neck sat the Crestmont diamonds, massive, ancient, and heavy enough to drown a lesser woman. "Lurk and watch, Margaret," Edmund whispered, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "The predators always move first." The first predator was her father. Silas Belrosi approached them, flanked by Richard. He wore a mask of performative grief, his eyes watery and red-rimmed. "Margaret," he cried, loud enough for the surrounding countesses to hear. "My poor, dear girl. Look at what he has done to you. You look so thin, so haunted. Come home, child. We have found a doctor from Vienna. There is hope yet for your condition." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt the weight of 100 gazes, all directed at her midsection, judging her worth by its silence. "Father," Margaret said, her voice carrying a diamond-edged clarity that cut through the murmurs. "You seem to have forgotten that the last time we spoke, you drew a black line through my name in the family ledger. I find it curious that my condition only became a matter of maternal concern once the Duke's checks stopped clearing." Silas went pale, his mouth working like a landed fish. "Margaret, you are being coerced. This iron-willed Duke has poisoned your mind." "On the contrary," Margaret stepped forward, her silk skirts sweeping the floor. "The Duke gave me a ledger, and in that ledger I found something far more interesting than a doctor from Vienna. I found a series of payments from Richard Calder to a certain firm in Kent. Your firm, father." Richard stepped in, his face a mask of practiced arrogance. "Careful, Duchess. A woman of your fragile health shouldn't concern herself with business. It's a strain on the nerves." "My nerves are made of the same granite as the Abbey, Richard," Margaret countered. She reached into her silk reticule and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment. "Lady Danbury, I believe you are the patroness of the Widows and Orphans Fund." The formidable Lady Danbury, watching from a gilded chair, nodded slowly. "I am." "Then you might be interested to know," Margaret said, projecting her voice to the farthest corner of the ballroom, "that the money Richard Calder has been donating to your fund actually consists of diverted coal rents from the northern mines, rents that belong to the Duke. He hasn't been being charitable. He has been laundering the Duke's own wealth to buy social favor." The room went deathly silent. Richard looked as though he might strike her. Edmund shifted, his hand moving toward the hilt of his ceremonial sword, his eyes fixed on his cousin with lethal intent. "That is a lie," Richard hissed. "Is it?" Margaret smiled, and it was the smile of a butcher tallying meat. "I have the duplicate receipts in the carriage. I have the bank statements from the London branch where you hold a secret account under the name Belrosi Associates. My father provided the name, you provided the stolen capital. You didn't want to rescue me, father. You wanted to fund your gambling through the Duke's pockets while Richard cleared the path to the dukedom." Silas turned and fled the room, unable to face the collective gasp of the ton. Richard stood frozen, the social elite backing away from him as if he were a leper. Margaret turned back to the crowd. "I am not a prisoner. I am the Duchess of Crestmont, and while I may never produce an heir to satisfy your curiosity, I can assure you that I am more than capable of managing the inheritance you so desperately crave." She turned to Edmund. His expression was no longer cold. He was looking at her with a raw, terrifying admiration, amen, seeing his equal for the first time. "Shall we dance, your grace?" he asked. "I think we should," Margaret replied. As they moved onto the floor, the orchestra began a waltz. They moved in perfect, lethal synchronicity. For the first time, the whispers were not about her infertility. They were about her power. "You destroyed them," Edmund whispered as he spun her past the stunned onlookers. "And one night you dismantled a conspiracy that took them years to build." "They underestimated a defective woman," Margaret said, leaning into him. "It's a mistake men have been making for centuries." "I will never make it again," Edmund vowed. He didn't kiss her, that would be too sentimental for the war they were waging, but he pressed his forehead against hers for a fleeting second. In that touch, Margaret felt the final chains of her childhood snap. She was no longer a ghost haunting her father's house. She was the architect of her own empire. The victory in London felt like a heavy crown. As the black carriage rolled back through the iron gates of Crestmont Abbey, the air felt charged, as if a storm was trapped within the very stone of the mountains. Margaret watched the battlements approach. She was exhausted, the weight of the Crestmont diamonds still feeling like a phantom pressure around her throat. "It's too quiet," Edmund said, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of the small dagger he had carried since the ball. The abbey was devoid of the usual evening bustle. No footmen waited at the entrance. The flickering torches in the hall were guttering their oil low. Mrs. Hrix was nowhere to be seen. "Richard," Margaret whispered. "A cornered animal doesn't flee, Edmund. It bites." They moved through the darkened corridors, their footsteps a frantic staccato against the stone. When they reached the east wing, the scent hit them, not the damp peat of the moor, but the sharp, choking stench of kerosene and old paper. "The office," Margaret gasped. "The evidence." She didn't wait for Edmund's command. She ran. The estate office was a furnace. Orange light spilled from beneath the oak door, and a low, hungry roar echoed from within. Margaret threw the door open, shielding her face from a blast of heat. Inside, the neat files she had painstakingly organized were being devoured by flames. And in the center of the room stood Richard. His eyes were bloodshot, his gold brocade vest stained with soot. He held a torch in one hand and a heavy iron poker in the other. "If I cannot inherit this empire," Richard hissed, his voice cracked with madness, "then no one will. I will burn every record, every lie you've used to steal what is mine by blood." "It was never yours, Richard," Margaret screamed over the crackle of the fire. She lunged for the desk, grabbing the black leather ledger, the one containing the secret bank records, just as the corner of the wood caught fire. Richard swung the poker. It narrowly missed her head, striking the stone wall with a bone-jarring clack. "You think you're a duchess," Richard laughed, a high, thin sound. "You're a ghost. A dry well. Once I kill Edmund and burn this marriage contract, you'll be back in the gutter where your father found you." He lunged again, but a shadow moved faster. Edmund tackled his cousin into the burning stacks of paper. They tumbled into the flames, a desperate, silent struggle of limbs and hatred. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter of water from the sideboard and shattered it over the desk, dousing the primary documents. Then, seeing Edmund pinned by the desperate strength of a madman, she picked up a heavy bronze bust of a Crestmont ancestor and swung it with every ounce of fury she had ever suppressed. It struck Richard's shoulder. He cried out, losing his grip. Edmund seized the moment, pinning Richard's throat against the burning floorboards. "The bloodline ends with me, Richard," Edmund growled, his face illuminated by the fire like a vengeful god. "By you? You and tonight." Edmund didn't kill him, not there, not in the flames. He dragged the coughing, broken man out of the room just as the ceiling beams began to groan. By dawn, the east wing was a blackened shell, but the abbey still stood. Margaret sat on the cold stone steps of the entrance hall, her face streaked with soot, her midnightable silk dress ruined beyond repair. In her lap she held the black ledger. It was scorched, the edges curled and brittle, but the ink was legible. Edmund emerged from the shadows, his coat gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal burns on his forearms. He sat beside her, the distance between them finally vanishing. He didn't say anything. He simply leaned his head against hers. "It's over," he said after a long silence. "Richard is in the custody of the magistrate. Your father has signed a full confession to avoid the gallows. We are the last of the line, Margaret." "The last," Margaret repeated. She looked out at the moor, where the first rays of a gray sun were breaking through the mist. "A line that ends in silence." Edmund took her hand, his fingers tracing the black and lace of her sleeve. "Is that what you want? Silence?" Margaret looked at the vast, empty abbey behind them. She thought of the orphans in London, the children who had been discarded because they were deemed defective or burdensome. She thought of the boy she had seen at the founding home, brilliant with numbers, but ignored because of a limp. "No," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to fill this house. Not with heirs of our blood, but with the children the world has forgotten. Let us use the Crestmont fortune to build a school, Edmund. A sanctuary for those who were told they were worthless. We will teach them to be swords. We will teach them to balance ledgers and command empires. Edmund looked at her, a look of profound quiet on his eyes. A lineage of choice, not of birth. A family of misfits, Margaret smiled, a real weary smile, built on the belief that value is earned, not inherited. Edmund stood, pulling her up with him. He looked at the Rue and Wing, then back at the woman who had transformed his cage into a kingdom. Then let us begin the work, Your Grace. 10 years later, Crestmont Abbey was no longer a tomb. The hallways echoed with the sound of children's laughter and the rhythmic scratching of quills in the new, fire-proof library. Margaret stood in the refurbished conservatory, watching a young girl with a prosthetic arm carefully prune the climbing roses. The girl was the top student in the Abbey's accounting program. Edmund appeared at her side, graying at the temples but looking younger than he had on the day they met. He handed her a fresh ledger, one filled with the names of 100 children whose lives had been saved by a Barren duchess. The Belrosi coal rights finally ran dry, Edmund observed. Good, Margaret said, leaning her head against his shoulder. I find I prefer the warmth of this house to the heat of a furnace anyway. She looked at her hand. She still wore the oversized gold band Edmund had given her at the altar. They'd fit her now. Not because she had changed, but because she had finally grown into the weight of her own power. She was Margaret Abigail Calder. She was a shield, a sword, and the mother of 100 futures. And as the sun set over the granite battlements, she realized that her father had been right about one thing. The line he had drawn through her name hadn't been an end. It had been a beginning. The transition from a warrior duchess to a guardian of the forgotten was not a path paved with velvet. Crestmont Abbey, once a fortress of solitude, was now a construction site of the soul. But as Margaret sat in the sun-drenched conservatory, a letter arrived that tasted of old copper and bitter ash. It was not addressed to the Duchess, but to the girl who had once lurked in the shadows of hallways. Beatrice had written it. The ink was smudged with tears, the handwriting jagged and frantic. Margaret, he has found another buyer. Not for the coal, but for me. Lord Vane, a man with breath like rotting meat and hands that never stay still. Father says I must settle the debts you left behind when you betrayed us. He is moving the wedding to Tuesday. Please, I do not want to be a ghost like you were. Margaret stood so abruptly her chair overturned. The quarterly reports for the Yorkshire mills fluttered to the floor like wounded birds. Edmund, she called, her voice echoing with a command that brought the Duke from his study within seconds. He took the letter from her trembling hand. As his eyes scanned the desperate plea, the winter sea gray of his gaze turned to ice. Vane, Edmund spat the name. The man is a predator who hides behind a peerage. HES already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. My father isn't just selling her, Margaret whispered, her eyes burning. He is executing her to spite me. He thinks because I have built a life here, I have grown soft. He thinks I am distracted by these children. He is a man who measures power by the ability to inflict pain, Edmund said, stepping toward her. He has forgotten that you are the one who handles the ledgers now. I don't just want to save her, Edmund, Margaret said, turning to face him. Her face was as cold as the granite cliffs outside. I want the house. I want the land. I want the very air he breathes. I want Silas Belrosi to understand what it feels like to have your world sold from under you while you are still standing in it. Edmund studied her for a long moment. A slow, dark smile, one of pure, lethal admiration, touched his lips. My solicitor has been quiet for a reason, Margaret. We have been buying up the Belrosi promissory notes for months. I was waiting for your command to pull the thread. Pull it, Margaret commanded. Pull it until there is nothing left, the dust. The return to Belrosi Manor was different this time. There was no rain, only a scorching, indifferent sun that revealed the full extent of the estate's decay. The hedges were overgrown, the gravel drive was choked with weeds, and the grand columns of the porch were cracked like ancient teeth. Silas Belrosi was on the porch, wearing a celebratory silk coat that he clearly couldn't afford. Beside him stood Lord Vane, a bloated, predatory man who watched the Crestmont carriage with a mixture of greed and suspicion. Beatrice stood behind them, her face a mask of terror, her hands bound by the delicate lace of a wedding gown that looked like a shroud. Margaret stepped out of the carriage. She didn't wait for Edmund. She walked straight toward her father, every step a declaration of war. "Margaret," Silas shouted, attempting to find his old booming authority. "You are too late. The contracts are signed. Lord Vane has been most generous in rectifying the ruin you brought upon this house. Generosity is a word that sits ill on the tongue of a man who trades children for gold." "Silas," Margaret said. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a heavy sheaf of legal documents, bound in the red ribbon of the High Court. Lord Vane stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is a private matter, Duchess. Your father has every right to settle his affairs." "I agree," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "And as of 10 o'clock this morning, his affairs are my affairs. You see, Lord Vane, Silas didn't just borrow money from you. He borrowed from the Bank of Over and Gurney. He borrowed from the London Guild of Merchants. He borrowed from every man foolish enough to listen to his lies." She tossed the documents at her father's feet. Silas stared at them as if they were vipers. "I have purchased every single one of those debts," Margaret continued. "The house, the land, the coal rights you tried to steal back, the very clothes you are wearing, they all belong to the Crestmont estate. And as your primary creditor, I am here to perform a final audit. You can't," Silas stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "This is Belrosi land, 400 years of. 400 years of men like you wasting the lives of women like us." Margaret cut him off. She looked at Beatrice. "Beatrice, go to the carriage. Now." "She stays," Vane roared, reaching for the girl's arm. Edmund stepped between them. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. The sheer, predatory stillness of the Duke was enough to make Vane stumble back. "The Duchess has spoken, Vane," Edmund said, his voice a low vibration of threat. "If you touch that girl, I will ensure that the remaining debt your father owes the crown is called in by nightfall. I believe you have several unaccounted for shipments in the East India docks." Vane went silent. He looked at Silas, then at the Duke, and finally at the wreckage of the Belrosi fortune. Without a word, he turned and fled toward his own carriage, leaving Silas standing alone on the porch of a house he no longer owned. Margaret walked up the steps until she was level with her father. She looked into his pale, watery eyes and saw only the hollow shell of a man who had tried to define her by her emptiness. "You crossed my name out, father," she said softly. "You told the world I was a liability. You sold me to a man you thought would break me." She looked around the crumbling porch. "I am the mistress of this house now, and my first act of authority is to tell you to leave. You have 1 hour to pack your things. You will be provided with a small cottage on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, a place where no one knows your name, and no one cares about your legacy. You will live on a pittance, and you will never, under any circumstances, speak to Beatrice again." "You're a monster," Silas hissed, his voice cracking. "A barren, cold-hearted monster." "No," Margaret said, a single tear of relief finally escaping. "I am a Belrosi who finally learned the true value of an asset. And you, Silas, are a depreciating one." As the carriage pulled away from the manor for the last time, Beatrice clutched Margaret's hand, her body shaking with sobs of release. In the front seat, Edmund sat with the ledger, his eyes fixed on Margaret with a depth of love that required no poetry. Margaret looked at the torn page from the family ledger, which she still carried. She reached out the window and let the wind take it. She watched it tumble and tear in the dust of the road until it was gone. The past was a debt settled in full. "Where are we going?" Beatrice asked, looking at the dark mountains on the horizon. "Home," Margaret said. "To a place where we don't have to be perfect to be loved. To a place where the silence is finally our own." The carriage sped toward Crestmont Abbey, leaving the ruins of the old world behind. Margaret Abigail Calder looked out at the rising moon and knew that while she would never leave a legacy of blood, she was building a legacy of iron, one that would outlast every name ever written in a book. The success of Crestmont Academy was a silent thunderclap that echoed far beyond the granite cliffs of the Abbey. What had begun as a sanctuary for broken children had, within a year, swelled into a vibrant hive of 25. But in the Victorian North, a woman who gathered the discarded and sharpened them into weapons was seen as more dangerous than a plague. The opposition crystallized in the form of Rector Barren, a man whose soul was as rigid as his starch-collared shirts. He arrived at the Abbey on a Tuesday, flanked by 3 local magistrates whose pockets had grown light ever since Margaret had audited the county's predatory lending practices. "Your Grace," Barren began, standing in the center of the great hall, his voice echoing with the practiced resonance of a pulpit. "There are grave concerns regarding the curriculum you have established here. We hear rumors of stable boys reading Latin, of foundling girls debating the ethics of property law, and of a general lack of spiritual humility." Margaret stood at the top of the stone dais, her hand resting on the hilt of a silver-headed cane. She wore a gown of charcoal wool, severe and commanding. Humility, Rector, is a virtue often demanded of the poor by those who wish to keep them silent. In this house, we prefer the virtue of clarity. Clarity? One of the magistrates, a man named Squire Higgins, stepped forward. "You are teaching these children to be dissatisfied with their station. You are raising an army of agitators. And under what authority? A woman who has no children of her own, who knows nothing of the sacred maternal instinct, acting as a guardian. It is unnatural. It is, frankly, a desecration of this abbey's history." The air in the hall turned frigid. Edmund, leaning against a pillar in the shadows, shifted, his hand tightening on his cane. But Margaret raised a hand, stopping him. "You speak of desecration, Squire," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a register of lethal silk. "But I see only a group of men terrified that the children they once walked past in the gutter have learned to read the fine print of their own exploitation. We have filed a petition with the bishop and the High Court," Barren announced, his eyes gleaming with a self-righteous fire, "to have this academy disbanded and the children returned to the workhouses where they might learn proper industry. We will argue that a woman of your biological limitations is mentally and morally unfit to oversee the upbringing of the next generation." Margaret felt the old sting, the ghost of the word worthless, attempting to claw its way back into her heart. But as she looked toward the balcony, she saw Thomas, the boy who had once been mute, watching her. He held a geometry text in his hand, his dark eyes steady and unafraid. "Then we shall have a trial," Margaret said, "but not in a courtroom filled with your peers. We will have it here in 3 days' time. I invite the gentry, the clergy, and the press. Let the world see what we are doing at Crestmont. If you can prove these children are being harmed, I will close the doors myself. But if they prove to be your intellectual equals, then you will leave this abbey and never return." The day of the great inquiry was a theater of cold limestone and burning intellect. The hall was packed with the cream of northern society, their furs and silks clashing with the austere surroundings. In the front row sat Silas Belrosi, invited by Barren to testify to his daughter's instability. He looked like a man savoring the prospect of a final, petty revenge. The rector opened the proceedings with a scathing indictment of Margaret's unfeminine pursuits, painting the school as a laboratory of social ruin. He then called upon Margaret to present her evidence. Margaret did not speak. She simply nodded to the children. Rachel, the 10-year-old girl who had been told she would never read because she saw letters backward, stepped forward. She didn't read a prayer. She walked to a large calcboard and began to solve a complex architectural equation involving the structural integrity of the Abbey's own crumbling house. The silence in the room was absolute as her chalk scratched out the logic of physics, logic she had learned by visualizing space where others saw only flat ink. Next was Thomas. The boy who had not spoken for 2 years stood before the rector. "Thomas," Barren sneered, "tell us, in your own words, what heresy the Duchess has taught you about the nature of a man's station in life." Thomas did not hesitate. His voice, though rusty from disuse, was clear and precise. "Her Grace taught me the Socratic method, Rector. So if I am to answer your question, I must first ask, by what logical metric do you define a station?" If it is by birth, then a king's fool is greater than a wise man born in a stable. If it is by character, then your question is a logical fallacy, as you have assumed my station is beneath yours without empirical evidence of our respective soul. A gas moved through the room like a physical wave. Squire Higgins stood, his face a mottled purple. This is insolence. This is the subversion of the natural order. No, Margaret said, stepping down from the dais to stand among her students. This is education. You are not angry because they are insolent, Squire. You are angry because they are no longer easy to lie to. You wanted them to be beasts of burden, but we have made them architects of thought. She turned to face the entire room, her gaze finally landing on her father. Silas looked away, unable to meet the fierce, triumphant light in her eyes. You attack my biological limitations, Margaret said, her voice echoing into the rafters. You claim that because I cannot bear a child, I cannot understand the future. But look at these children. They are not my blood, but they are my legacy. They are the proof that a woman's worth is not a vessel for a man's name, but a spark for a human mind. I have not raised an army of agitators, Rector. I have raised a generation of witnesses. The journalists in the back of the hall were writing so fast their quills threatened to snap. One of them, a woman from the Manchester Guardian, stood and began to applaud. Slowly, then with increasing fervor, the sound grew until it filled the hall, drowning out Bannon's protests. The petition was withdrawn before the week was out. The scandal hadn't destroyed Margaret, it had sanctified her. Crestmont Academy was no longer a secret experiment, it was a beacon. That night, Edmund found Margaret in the library, looking at the torn page of the Bilrosi ledger she had kept as a bookmark. They'll never stop trying to find a crack in the armor, you know, Edmund said, pouring two glasses of wine. I know, Margaret said, leaning her head against his shoulder. But I find him no longer worried about the cracks. That's how the light gets into the house after all. Edmund kissed her temple, a rare, tender gesture that spoke of a decade of shared battles. To the architect of heresy. To the family we chose, Margaret replied. As the wind howled across the moors, the abbey felt warmer than it ever had in its 400-year history. The stone didn't feel like a prison anymore, it felt like a spine, and yielding, strong, and supporting a world that had only just begun to be born. The winter of 1855 arrived with a cruelty that seemed personal. The frost turned the granite walls of the abbey into sheets of ice, and the cost of heating the sprawling school threatened to swallow the remaining Crestmont reserves. Margaret, ever the guardian of the ledgers, found herself staring at the numbers until they blurred into jagged teeth. It was during this season of dwindling coal and rising stakes that a man named Elias Thorne arrived. He was not a relative, but a ghost from the Calder Pasta solicitor who had served Edmund's father before the poison had claimed him. Your Grace, Thorne said, sitting in the library, his hands trembling as he clutched a leather portfolio stained by seawater and time. The Crestmont curse is not a matter of bad blood or divine punishment. It is a matter of geography. There is a reason your uncles killed each other, and it wasn't just for the title. Edmund leaned against the mantel, the firelight catching the sharp, dangerous lines of his profile. My father whispered of a founding debt. I thought it was the delirium of the arsenic. It was the secret of the abyss, Thorne whispered. The first Duke didn't just build this abbey, he built a vault. Beneath the east wing, lower than the wine cellars, lies the Crestmont Covenant. It is a collection of privateer contracts and royal trade secrets from the Elizabethan era. Documents that, if brought to light, would force the crown to pay a restitution that would make the Bilrosi coal rights look like pocket change. Margaret looked up from her accounts, her mind instantly calculating the implications. That's why Richard tried to burn the East Wing. He wasn't just destroying my files, he was trying to force the stone to crack, to reveal the entrance he couldn't find. The entrance requires two things, Thorne said, looking at Margaret with an unnerving intensity. The Duke's blood and the mind of someone who can solve an unlinear cipher. The first Duke was a paranoid man, Your Grace. He designed the vault to be opened by a partnership, a man of action and a woman of logic. He believed that if a couple couldn't work together, they didn't deserve the fortune. The descent began at midnight. Margaret and Edmund moved past the charred ruins of the estate office, down a narrow spiral of stairs that smelled of damp earth and stagnant centuries. Edmund carried a heavy iron lantern, its flame flickering in the thin air. Margaret carried the cipher Keythorn had provided, a series of seemingly random numbers etched into a silver plate. "If we don't return by morning," Edmund said, his voice echoing in the darkness, "Mrs. Hrix has instructions to send the children to the London estate." "We are returning, Edmund," Margaret said, her hand grazing the cold, weeping stone of the tunnel. "I haven't spent 10 years fighting my father and the gentry just to be buried by a dead duke's paranoia." They reached a massive door of black basalt, unmarked except for a series of rotating brass rings and a small, sharp indentation in the center. "The blood first," Edmund said. He drew a small silver blade and pressed his thumb against the steel. He pressed the crimson rope into the center of the basalt. A low, subterranean groan vibrated through the floor. The brass rings began to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light. "The cipher," Margaret. Edmund stepped back, his breath hitching. "The rings are moving. If they align incorrectly, the mechanism will flood the chamber with silt from the moor." Margaret stepped forward, the silver plate in her hand. She looked at the rotating rings. They were inscribed with astronomical symbols and Greek letters. To anyone else, it was a mess of mysticism. To Margaret, it was a ledger. It was an audit of the stars. "It's not a code, Edmund," she whispered, her fingers flying across the cold brass. "It's a balance sheet. The first Duke was an accountant of the high seas. He didn't think in poems, he thought in percentages." She rotated the first string to the symbol of the merchant's cross, the second to the ratio of the golden mean, the third to the prime number that represented the original Crestmont investment. Click, click, click. The basalt door didn't swing open, it dissolved into the floor. Beyond lay a small, dry chamber. In the center sat a chest of iron-bound cedar. But as Edmund moved toward it, Margaret caught his arm. "Wait." She looked at the floor. The dust was undisturbed, but the patterns on the tiles were inconsistent. It was a final trap, a weight-sensitive floor designed to crush anyone who moved with greed rather than coordination. "We have to move together," Margaret said, her eyes locked on the ceiling. "The weight must be distributed perfectly across the central axis. If one of us stumbles, the other dies." Edmund looked at her, the lantern light reflecting the absolute, terrifying trust in his eyes. He didn't ask if she was sure. He simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "On your count, Margaret. 1, 2, 3. They moved as one shadow. Every step was a synchronized prayer. Margaret felt the tension in Edmund's arm, the way he adjusted his weight to compensate for her smaller frame. It was a dance more intimate than any waltz in a London ballroom. It was the physical manifestation of the 10 years they had spent defending each other's ghosts. They reached the chest. Edmund flipped the lid. Inside were not piles of gold, but dozens of tin tubes, sealed with wax. Beneath them lay a single, massive bar of solid gold, inscribed with the words for the continuation of the unconventional. Margaret opened the first tube. It was a royal charter signed by Elizabeth I, granting the Calder family a permanent percentage of all trade from the Spice Islands, a contract the modern British government had conveniently lost during the Napoleonic Wars. "This is it," Margaret whispered, a tear of pure, cold relief racing a path through the dust on her cheek. "The school, the children, their futures. It's all here. We don't need the Belrosi coal. We don't need the gentry's approval. We are the masters of the crown's own debt." Edmund didn't look at the gold. He looked at Margaret, his hand still gripping her so tightly it bruised. "The lawyer said it took 2 people," Edmund said, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent a lifetime suppressing. "He was wrong. It didn't take 2 people. It took you." "It took us, Edmund," Margaret corrected. She leaned her forehead against his, the darkness of the abyss finally losing its teeth. "A barren woman and a cursed duke. We were the only ones who could see the logic in the dark." As they climbed back toward the light, carrying the tin tubes that would rewrite the history of the North, Margaret felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with wealth. She thought of her name, once crossed out in black ink. She thought of her father rotting in his cottage on the moor. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't an entry in a ledger. She was the light in the abyss. And as they emerged into the great hall, where the children were beginning to wake for their morning lessons, Margaret knew that the Crestmont curse was finally broken. Not by a birth, but by a choice. The silence of the abbey was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the quiet, steady breathing of a world that was finally, truly, free. Margaret Abigail Calder lived for another 40 years. She never bore a child, yet she died surrounded by hundreds of sons and daughters who carried her logic, her iron will, and her name into the dawn of a new century. She proved that a woman's life is not a story written by her father's quill or her husband's needs, but a ledger she must audit for herself. And in the end, her name was never crossed out again. It was written in stone in the hearts of the forgotten and in the very wind that howls across the granite cliffs of Crestmont Abbey. For love is not a matter of blood. It is a matter of the covenant we make in the dark. This story proves that a true duchess and a true partner isn't defined by the lines drawn in a family ledger or the perceived chains of biology. She is defined by the razor-sharp precision of her mind and the magnitude of what she is willing to sacrifice to reclaim a kingdom lost to greed and shadow. Silas and Richard held the ancient prejudices of a dying patriarchy, but Margaret possessed a cold, brilliant fire that burned through their lies and rewrote the laws of inheritance forever. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster of Victorian intrigue, forbidden tension, and a love that redefined a legacy, please give this video a massive thumbs up. Your support truly helps this channel grow and lets me know that you crave more powerful, high-stakes historical romances like The Legend of the Iron Duchess. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I have another heart-connecting Regency romance coming next week involving a disgraced, scandalous widow and a ruthless, scarred earl who will do anything to protect the woman society once turned away. You absolutely do not want to miss it. It's going to be a wild ride from the very first minute. What was your favorite moment in today's epic tale? Was it the breathtaking moment Margaret dismantled Richard's lies in the London ballroom, or the legendary scene in the abyss where she and Desmond moved as one to claim their future? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I love hearing your theories on the Crestmont Academy and the fate of the forgotten children. Until next time, stay fierce, stay brilliant, and I'll see you in the next chapter.